My heart hurts for our community, but I want to make it very clear that hate will not prevail in this county. I want that to be very clear and known.
And before we head down to the scene of today's shooting, we are back with former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi. Frank, you have the unenviable task of talking us through so many of these shootings, so many of them that happen at schools. I find, frankly, shattering and destabilizing. As someone who sends my kid to school every day. Also joining us is Dave Cullen. He's the author of the books Parkland and Columbine. We turn to you a lot on days like this, and you run out of new things to say. So I'm going to turn over the airwaves to the students who witnessed this horror today. Here are two of them, a 10th grader and another student worried about their younger sibling.
It was just like a loud boom, as if a locker had slammed. So my teacher thought it was just like some kid acting foolish. So then she took a peek outside, and then we heard repeatedly the banging again, and that's when we could identify it was the gun. And then the hard lockdown was placed, and then we ran to the back of the classroom, turned off the lights. I was shaking, scared, and I didn't have my phone on me, and I couldn't communicate with my mom for half an hour. And I didn't know what was going to happen because you could hear the gunfires right down the hall.
Over at the middle school, if my siblings were okay.
26.
That's what I was most worried about. I was worried. I thought I was going to die. I was holding some random kid's hand. My face was in somebody's fight. I was just trying to get away. But they could have. You never know. I just know they were on our hall. I didn't get to see anything. I was head down. Like outside, I just saw the aftermath.
Dave, you never unsee the aftermath, do you?
No. I go back and forth between it, just like tearing me up, and then some days like today, I'm numb. And I never know what's coming, but it is sometimes too much. Today, I'm sort of in analytical mode because I was stunned that he was so young, and that, as your journalist said, they're getting younger and younger. I was also taken aback. I continue to be that more of them are living through this. You know, in Columbine, I said that we needed to understand these as murder-suicides because they virtually all die in the act, and they all know this. It's not true anymore. I want to go back and check, but maybe 8 years ago, somewhere in that span, some started living through it, and it's been more and more. It's still the minority, but you know, there's a different mindset among some of these, and perhaps the younger kids. That I'm not even sure what to make of that. Perhaps Frank does. But it's just so horrible. And you know, I immediately go to Shannon Watts's Twitter page and Gabby Giffords, and they always have a lot of insight. And it shocked me that Georgia doesn't have a law requiring these to be locked up. What sane person wouldn't also think that was necessary?
Yeah, Frank, I mean, the truth is that these happen with enough of a pace that the three of us have had this conversation before. But it is so jarring to think that for 4 families, their life will never be the same. Today is that sharp drop-off where life changed forever. And that's the case with the Uvalde families. That's the case with the Columbine families. That's the case with the Parkland families. That's the case with the Newtown families. That's the case with the Buffalo families. I mean, we live in a country where we have these conversations in the wake of these horrors. We turn to these gorgeous young faces who speak with all the wisdom of kids who've been through the drills and simply recount to us how long it took them to remember what they were supposed to do in an active shooter drill. Who's looking at what that does to them?
I'm not aware of anyone. There is a school of research that is looking at how to best conduct drills in an age-appropriate way. That's getting some traction. But with regard to the long-term impact of these drills and these shootings, We now have a generation that's been raised on this. I'm now a grandparent, and certainly my kids were raised on this from kindergarten forward, and now my grandkids are experiencing this, and we don't know where this goes, except perhaps that we have this kind of copycat thing that's going on and has been mentioned, maybe more shooters surrendering so they can experience the infamy that comes with this. One of the stark contrasts here for me and for those perhaps on the far right saying, yeah, we still shouldn't be doing anything about gun safety. Two things today were true at the same time. Everything went right. Two armed school resource officers immediately confronted the shooter, who immediately surrendered. The school went into hard lockdown. The notification went out. Everybody did what they're supposed to do in their classrooms, and the outcome was horrible. So if you're okay with that outcome, see, look, armed officer saved the day. See, look, we know how to harden the school quickly. Yeah, and we have 4 people dead and 9 additional people shot. Are you good with that outcome? I'm not.
Priya Sidar is covering this tragedy for us in Winder, Georgia. Priya, what's the latest?
Yeah, well, we were just briefed by authorities moments ago and learned a little bit more about the shooter. Of course, we know that he is a 14-year-old male student at Appalachia High School. They weren't able to say if he had any sort of connection to the victims, both to those 2 teachers and the 2 students who were killed, or the additional 9 gunshot victims. They did say that they got an opportunity to question him, but they said that this is a very early investigation at this point and that we're going to be doing several more interviews into the coming hours. But I can tell you that this has been a very frantic and emotional scene today as parents and families were rushing over to this area trying to be reunited with their students. This school is directly across the street from a preschool and right next to a middle school. So there are students of all ages who were within this one little block. And law enforcement had really blocked off all the roads. So parents were just leaving their cars on the side of the road and walking sometimes over a mile to try to get to this school to find their students. And I did get an opportunity to speak to some students, and as you can imagine, they were quite shaken up, many of them saying that they heard gunshots inside of the school, but they weren't sure whether or not it was a drill. They said that normally they are notified if there's any sort of drill, but they all began huddling together, praying with one another, and they really didn't know if they were going to be able to see their families at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, Dave Cullen, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution reported what some of those conversations sound like. I'm going to read them again. At 10:23 a.m., 11th grader Henry Vanderwalt texted his mother, quote, "I think there's a school shooting." Minutes later, Becky Vanderwalt got another message. "I love you," Henry wrote. The text exchange was likely repeated hundreds of times during several chaotic hours for both students and parents. Students were led from the school outside, where parents rushed to find them. Frantic parents rushed to the school, with many forced to park and walk, as our reporting confirms. But this ritual of texting your parents to, I don't know what else to call it, proof of life. I'm still here. It wasn't me today. This is it's just more than a gun safety crisis. This is more than an easy access to gun mixing with the soup of adolescent angst and mental health crisis. This is an epidemic of trauma and terror that we send our kids to school with. This is part of the conversation about phones and screens and communication. And this is life in America.
Yeah, I'm so glad that Frank brought up about the much wider net of people traumatized. The SWAT teams, if they were involved, but all the first responders. With Columbine, I remember Patrick Ireland was the boy in the window who went out, and they caught him on the back of an armored car, and they were really distraught the next day. Everyone involved, there was a whole huge team, because they needed to know whether it was okay, and because he'd been shot in the brain. Through a speech center, he could still speak a little in the ambulance, but he couldn't. His name was Patrick, and he kept saying, Rick. So they thought it was Rick, and so he was logged in as Rick. And but the SWAT team people knew he was Patrick, and they couldn't find any Patrick. And it really, all these people are human beings, and every level, the neighbors, even their whole schools are really, really traumatized by this. And sometimes the parents, I remember Cameron Kasky's mom, and he's the one who started the March for Our Lives in his living room. His mom was on a cruise in the Caribbean, and so she couldn't get there, and she didn't know how to get there, and she didn't even know when they could get to a port. It's not that uncommon. People go through terrible things. But one more thing, I hope and pray they have gotten this right. If the families haven't all been notified yet, the way they gather people and notify them, especially when there's a very large number. I couldn't believe it. Parkland, 19 years after Columbine, it was still 1 a.m, and all these people were at the center gathered, and they always do the math. As all these parents come, and more parents leave, and they have some idea of how many shots. The math is less and less in their favor. And at that one, it was like midnight or 1 a.m. They finally started telling them, and they brought each one out into a separate room, and but it lasted over an hour. And Manny, they called him Tio Manny. He finally just started yelling at them, like, I want to know if my son is alive, and they also took him into other rooms at the Marriott to tell them, and people in the waiting room could hear the screams through the walls. And, we at least need to get that down. And I pray that of all the things, this shouldn't be happening, right? But for God's sake, get that down. Obviously you have to plan ahead, but that's really humanitarian horror.
It's just in the category of too hideous to wrap our brains around, but we must. Vice President Kamala Harris